There's nobody in the waiting room yet. So.
That doesn't seem right.
It doesn't. I'm a little worried.
Hmm.
You guys have such active community members that nobody in the waiting room is a little bit disconcerting.
I know. Do you are there maybe there is maybe a Parks and Rec commissioner who's not part of the advisory committee who might have registered to watch the meeting? Do you know? Are any of those names?
There were a few people that did do that. Nikki Fox.
Okay, all right. Let me just
And
check with.
I'm doing it on
Okay.
my phone too as a test, just to be like, what is happening?
Okay.
Is it possible that a different link got sent out to the main or other non-panelists or something?
Oh, here they come. They're coming.
Oh, good.
Okay, there we go.
There they are. Okay.
Hi, everyone. We're going to give just 2 minutes more, 7:05, to get everybody in, and then we will start the meeting. We're holding stable at 22 attendees. Bridget, let's start just a few seconds before 7:05.
Okay. All right. Are we ready? Dana, John, Ivy, are you ready?
Let's go.
Okay. All right. Good evening, everybody. This is our welcome to the fourth and final PROS Master Plan Advisory Committee meeting. As long promised and long awaited, we're going to be talking specifically about open space. And so we brought our open space consultant, WRA, to speak to you this evening. There's a lot of material to cover. So without further ado, I'm going to hand off to Dana Falk from Gates and Associates to get this presentation going. Thank you all for joining us this evening.
Exactly what Bridget said. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to do a very quick overview of what the PROS plan has done to date, and then jump straight into the open space management plan and all the amazing work that they're doing. And then also talk at the end very briefly about upcoming steps and how this is going to get through adoption, and then have time for comment from the public and from the advisory committee members. Just a reminder, tons of information on the belmontprosplan.com website, and always accepting emails and comments at info@belmontprosplan.com. We can make a great plan for you guys. Before we go too much further, I wanted to take a step back and let WRA introduce themselves. You know Bridget, you've met me before at the advisory committee meeting number 3. So now it's time for John and Ivy and Leslie to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm John Boss. I'm a senior open space planner at WRA Environmental. I'm the project manager for this effort. I've been doing open space planning work off and on for about 25 years. I actually started my career working for the U.S. Forest Service, where I did outdoor recreation planning and wildfire management related work. I have an educational background in wildlife biology, outdoor recreation planning, and forest resource management. And I'll let Ivy and Leslie introduce themselves now. But good to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm a scientist with WRA, and my specialty is botany and wetland ecology. My focus for this project has been on the environmental assessment, and my early career background is in parks and recreation. I worked for the Bureau of Land Management and the city of San Luis Obispo, and my later experience has been more biology, planning, environmental science in the consulting world.
I'm Leslie Lazzarati. I'm a principal at WRA. I've been at the firm for about 17 years, which sounds crazy, but is true. And during that time, I've gained a lot of experience permitting a myriad of types of projects and a myriad of types of communities throughout the Bay Area and California in general. So I'm helping out with kind of overseeing some of the regulatory and permitting components, as well as some strategic overall guidance type of things biology-wise.
Thanks, WRA. Real quick overview of what the PROS plan has been doing. Existing conditions have been assessed. We've done a ton of community engagement, still ongoing. We've done benchmarking and looked at recreation and park design trends, find the typologies for the parks in Belmont, as well as done park-specific recommendations, which we got overwhelming amount of comments from the public to make those even more fine-tuned for Belmont itself. The goals and strategies have been set up. I'm going to go through those very high level in just a moment. We're working on prioritizing the recommendations to form an action plan, continuing community engagement, and of course, the open space management plan. So the PROS plan will have 12 goals organized into 4 big ideas: the city as your backyard, outdoor recreation for all, celebrate the outdoors, and prioritize environmental and financial sustainability. Each of these 4 big ideas has 3 goals that are more action-oriented to make implementable changes. I'm going to scroll through them very quickly here. They'll be posted online for you to look at a later date.
What committee?
Just a summary of all of the engagement that has been going on over the life of the plan, more to come. The community survey got 2,800 responses, and we've received over 730 emails from the community about the different things that the PROS plan is addressing. We've talked to the Parks and Rec Commission. Bridget goes every month and gives them a status update. We've conducted 11 focus groups for advisory committee meetings, presented to the City Council 3 times, and there's constant pop-up at city events for people to participate. Without further ado, let's jump into the open space management plan.
Thanks, Dana, and hello again, everybody. So the open space management plan basically fits into the PROS plan under goal 7. So that's WRA's component. And so I'm just going to give a bit of an overview on the planning process, our tasks, and our progress to date. So basically, the purpose of the open space management plan is to guide the city in making decisions for managing sensitive resources, balancing recreation uses, and mitigating hazards. Next slide, please. So this map basically just depicts our study area, the open space areas for which we're doing the open space management plan. On the left-hand side is San Juan Canyon, which is the smaller of the open space areas. Then the larger, kind of more sprawling open space across the lower part of the map here is the Water Dog Lake area. You can see the boundaries in red, which are approximate, I would say, and then you have a bunch of black lines basically crisscrossing the open space areas that represent the trail. So that's our study area. That's what we've been focused on here for the last couple months as we've started the plan. Next slide. So our plan has 8 tasks. There's a project startup and orientation, which we did in January. There's been a review of existing information. The city gave us 7 planning documents to review, and we spent some time on that early on in the process. We've been developing goals and policies and implementation actions for the plan, probably for about a month or so at this point. We've just finished describing existing environmental conditions. Ivy's going to speak to that component of our progress here shortly. We're working on and just finishing a draft of a recreation use assessment. That's task 5, basically to describe current and potential future recreation activities. And as we get done with task 3, the idea of developing goals and policies, we're going to start developing management alternatives. And the way the plan is structured, we're going to develop 2 alternatives. Once we're done with all those tasks, we'll basically roll all those items into an open space management plan. And that plan basically like slots in, if you will, into the overall PROS plan. Once the plan's been sufficiently vetted internally, then it'll go out for public review and comment, and then ultimately go to City Council for adoption in July. So that's sort of a summary of the process. Next slide, please. So what we've been working on, especially in the last couple of weeks, we've got 4 concurrent tasks. We're working on this goals, policies, and implementation actions task. Like I said, we're working on describing environmental conditions, looking at current and potential recreation activities, and we just started a few days ago starting to think about what management alternatives, 2 of them, what they would look like. So those are tasks that are all concurrent. I would say we're in like a period of maximum busyness on this plan right now. We have a lot going on. So next slide, please. So the goals and the policies and implementation items, these are really the guts of the plan. So we have spent a lot of time on this. We've had several meetings talking about what goals and policies should actually be in the plan. We started by looking at what the city had in the various planning documents. I believe there were 7 that we reviewed. And so we reviewed items such as the climate action plan or the hazard mitigation plan. We reviewed the conservation element of the general plan. We reviewed the 1992 PROS plan. So we looked at all these plans and basically looked at what we thought were relevant goals and policies to bring forward into this open space management plan. Then in addition to that, we've looked at some other, what I would say, best in class resource management, open space management plans. And we've looked at reviewing and adapting goals, policies, and implementation items from those plans. And those include the resource management policies from the Mid-Peninsula Open Space District, and then also the plan for Marin County's road and trail system for their entire open space preserve system, which is like 60,000 acres and covers about 250 miles of trails. That's a project that WRA completed with a couple other consulting firms about 8 or 9 years ago. So looking at existing goals and policies, but then also looking at adapting some things from, like I said, from best in class plans. Next slide, please. So just wanted to make sure we're all speaking the same language here. So I thought it was important to put some definitions down by what we mean, because people will use the terms goals and policies sometimes interchangeably, sometimes differently. So for the purpose of this open space management plan, this is how we're defining these key terms. A goal is a general statement that articulates a desired outcome. So in the context of open space management, the goal could be reduce wildfire hazards. A policy is basically a more specific statement that talks about what steps the city will take to achieve a desired outcome. So again, in the case of looking at wildfire hazards, a policy might be to reduce excessive fuels on slopes and ridgelines in the open space areas. And then an implementation action is basically a measurable action that specifies how a desired outcome would be achieved. And so again, in the case of our wildfire hazard example here, that might be something like using grazing and using manual labor to remove excessive fuels on ridgelines and slopes in the open space area. So those are the sort of the hierarchy of goals, policies, and implementation actions. As we've gone through this exercise in task 3, we also realized there were some other key terms we needed to defined. Two of them are examples here: riparian resources and sensitive resources. And so that will come out as part of the draft management plan as well. Some key definitions to these other terms. Next slide. So basically, when we looked at the documents, the 7 documents that we received from the city, and we looked at what we thought was relevant to these categories, these key definitions, we found basically 4 categories that seem pertinent to what we're doing with the open space management plan: the protection of sensitive resources, trail maintenance, visitor demand and management, and then visitor safety and hazard management. So those were things we wanted to keep from the existing documents that the city already has on the books, so to speak. Next slide, please. But then in addition to that, we identified some new categories that need to be in the plan as well. And this is really based on management issues and concerns we've heard from city staff, but as well as public comments. And we understand that there are a lot of public comments. I think we've reviewed all of them at least once at this point in time. And based on those inputs, I guess you could say, we came up with these additional 6 categories. So how to deal with new unauthorized trails, trail closures that would apply to redundant trails, protection of riparian resources, adaptive management, use of e-bikes, and wildfire hazards. So those are some more contemporary categories that we're going to look at as we're formulating the goals, policies aspect of the plan. Next slide, please. I'm going to pause here for a few minutes and let Ivy talk about task 4, the environmental assessment.
Hi, everyone. So for the environmental assessment, we conducted a database search based on all of the resources that you see before you. So all of these databases we pulled from roughly like a 5 to 10 mile radius for all of the special status species that could potentially occur on site. And we would screen everything out based on the habitats that we did observe on site during our recon visit. Next slide, please. In addition to document the baseline conditions, we needed to map out all of the habitat types. So there was an existing data set that was available through the San Mateo County vegetation mapping effort. So what we did was, once we went out in the field, we would stop at each of these habitats, confirm that this was the correct type of habitat, because usually what happens in these large scale mapping exercises is it's very broad. It's sometimes when you get down to a project level, it can be sometimes inaccurate. So we would verify the habitat types and then document what the dominant species are in each of these habitat types. We also looked at the conditions of all of the trails within these 2 open spaces and looked at things like erosion levels, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then as we're moving along, we determined if existing conditions would provide suitable habitat for any of the special status plant or wildlife species that was identified in the database search that I mentioned previously. And lastly, we had certain categories, qualitative categories that we used to assess how just generally the vegetation was doing from the trails. Next slide, please. As I was walking along, I definitely did see Western leatherwood. So there are several well-documented occurrences within Water Dog Park. And the scientific name for this is Durca occidentalis. And as I was walking along the trails, I did spot a handful that was right next to the trail. And as our wildlife biologist was accompanying me, he did see numerous houses. So it's that kind of stick structure you see on the left photo, just kind of scattered throughout the open space lands. And so we're kind of in the preliminary process of determining suitable habitat for all the other species that were identified to be in San Mateo County and beyond. Next slide, please. For the trail assessment, we reviewed the following. So trail erosion, the presence of multiple trails or like braided trails in a single area, the presence of legacies trails. So that was anything that was not mapped as an official trail for the city of Belmont. and any stream crossings. For stream crossings, we overlay the National Wetland Inventory layer and the trails layer. And as we were kind of going through the intersection of trail and stream features, we would just document the general conditions of the creek and just make note of any special observations. Next slide. So in the next few slides, we'll show examples of low, medium, and high erosion. And these examples were used for me and our wildlife biologist, or just the other person that was out with me, so we can kind of calibrate on what exactly these categories mean. So this is a low erosion feature. As you can see, there's small, like a small channel developing in the middle, likely from water. And next slide shows the medium erosion. So you can see that, you know, left unattended, these erosion features usually turn into something bigger. And then the next slide is an example of high erosion where there's multiple ruts. So yeah, that was definitely one of the worst features, or one of the worst erosion examples. Next slide. And I'll give this back to John.
Thanks, Ivy. So yeah, we are madly working on task 4 right now. We're crunching through the results. Ivy and I had a little bit of a side conversation this afternoon about where we stand, and we're in good standing on it. But yeah, that was a good overview of where we are to this point. So moving on to the next task, the recreational use assessment. It has like 2 components to it. The first component is to look at current and future recreation uses, and just a few principles about like recreation use and what drives it, whether it's in Belmont open space areas or other areas. There is an influence of population. We did some background research on Belmont's population and found that it had grown about 10% over the last decade, so 1% a year. We also looked at a little bigger area at San Mateo County as a whole over the last decade, and as a whole, the county grew a little slower than that. They grew at 6.5% over the last decade. But what's really important to note is other factors like the pandemic, like emerging new technologies such as e-bikes. Those can influence use of open spaces in Belmont and other locations much more so than the population size. When you think about the pandemic and what it did to recreation use, we did some work for San Mateo County in 2019 and 2020, and the 2 parks that we were looking at, they showed a 40% increase in visitation just from that one pre-pandemic year to the pandemic year. So some of those other factors other than population are important. The other thing we looked at for this piece of the recreation use assessment were some regional park surveys, not surveys done explicitly for this PROS planning effort. I know there's been work done around that, but some other regional surveys. So one of the surveys we looked at was for San Mateo County parks. The other survey was actually statewide, done by California State Parks. It's done periodically about every 5 years, and they break that survey down into geographic regions. So we looked at what was going on in terms of recreation, activity participation in the San Francisco Bay counties. And basically what those 2 regional park surveys showed was that trail use, wildlife viewing, scenery viewing were some of the most frequently engaged in activities for open space areas. So just based on that, you know, we think that that likely has some application to what's happening in the Belmont open space areas. And we also know from those regional surveys that there seems to be unmet demand for those kind of activities. So if we were to look more into the future, it seems likely that continued trail use, continued wildlife, and scenery viewing are going to be important on the Belmont open space areas. The next slide, please. So the other component to this task is what to do, how to manage the open space trail system. And so one of the basic premises that you'll see in best in class trail maintenance and design handbooks is that trail system design, if it's done right, and maintenance can accommodate varying levels of recreation use while avoiding environmental degradation. The other thing that you find in Belmont open space areas and others as well is legacy trails that have been there for a long time. They weren't always built or designed with current best management practices in mind. So that's something we're going to be looking at in terms of making recommendations for future maintenance, future design practices as we put the plan together. 2 documents in particular that we're looking at to help us do that are the California State Parks Trails Handbook and the Los Angeles County Trails Manual. They both have some really good very site-specific information about how you can design trails, how you can maintain trails. And then just another thing that'll probably get in there in some form is management options for legacy trails. These particular options shown here were things that we had developed for the Marin open space road and trail management plan. So some of the options that we were looking at there across all their trails were reconstructing trails that maybe were damaged in some fashion in its current exact location, constructing a new segment of trail along the same general route or alignment, doing a reroute to maybe a different geographic area, but at least keeping the trail intact, seasonally closing trails either due to wet weather conditions or bird nesting or other kinds of environmental constraints, and then permanent closure. So I think, you know, some of these management options could come into play here as we're putting the open space management plan together. Next slide, please. So we are developing two management plans or two management alternatives for the plan. And like I said earlier, each one of these alternatives basically represents a mix of goals, policies, and implementation actions. And again, they're meant to address management concerns, they're meant to address public comments. And typically what happens in the planning process, right, is planners develop what I would call bookend alternatives, where one alternative is status quo, things pretty much stay as they are. The other bookend is radical change, whether it's like maximum build out under a general plan or some other form of extremism, if you will. Those bookends tend to be, you know, the first thing that planners develop. We're taking a little bit more nuanced approach, at least so far early in this task, of developing two alternatives that meet some of the same goals or have some of the same goals. So the choice between alternatives that will come before this group and other decision bodies, you know, within the city, it's not going to be an all or none choice, I don't think. You know, that could change, but at this point in time, you know, we want to develop two alternatives that have some of the same features. And I'll give an example here in a minute. Next slide, please. So basically, you know, we pulled all these categories out of all our planning document reviews, whether it was the city documents or whether it was the best in class documents. We have these 10 categories, and we want to make sure that both management alternatives hit all these main categories. We don't want one alternative that's just going to hit categories 1 through 5, and then the next one hits 6 through 10. So it's important that both alternatives meet de minimis requirements, basically. Next slide, please. So all these categories that show in the previous slide, we'll define these. So again, people know what we're talking about, so we have a common language, but I've got another slide teed up here that uses these particular management actions. So I just wanted to provide sort of some impromptu definitions here. So trail maintenance, you could consider that periodic regular actions to clean or repair drainage structures. Habitat restoration, we could consider that identifying areas where native plants could be successfully restored, and then designing and implementing restoration plans. Adaptive management, that could involve periodically collecting information on resources conditions, and then to determining if there are any follow-up actions to meet restoration or protection goals. And then wildfire hazards, we could define that as periodically reducing excessive fuels through, say, grazing, manual labor, and mechanized equipment. So let's go to the next slide, please. So as we were getting ready for this meeting, one of the questions that was posed is, what do we want from you? What do we want from the advisory committee? And I think where we need help in teeing up these two management alternatives is really, how should the city and whatever partners it engages allocate effort to implement the open space management plan? So I just took those top 4 categories that I defined in the previous slide. These are purely hypothetical. These don't reflect anybody's particular preferences, but you know, getting it sort of where this body sees, you know, efforts being put. I mean, here we have habitat restoration at, you know, 38% at the highest, but we also have wildfire hazards getting a very high level of effort, 36% of the effort, and then adaptive management and trail maintenance getting much lower, but more or less equal levels of effort. So if you think about, if you had $1 to spend on these 4 items out of the 10, how would you allocate your effort? That's really where we need some help in moving forward on the management alternatives. And just one other thing I wanted to point out. So habitat restoration is not, you know, people think about habitat restoration as creating new things. You think about wildfire hazards as removing vegetation, Those two goals don't have to contradict. You can have both. You can do habitat restoration. You can do wildfire hazards within the same open space area. So I just wanted to point that out. Next slide, please. So this is what we've learned so far in going through the first couple tasks. As I said earlier, existing plans really focused on 4 categories that we've gone through a couple times. The new policies we're working on are looking at different categories: adaptive management, trail management, protecting riparian resources, e-bikes, and wildfire hazards. There are trail sections that are in poor condition. We do know that much, even though we haven't processed all the data and made final conclusions, but there are some sections that need immediate attention. Habitat conditions are actually pretty good across the open space areas. We found 2 special status species, as Ivy had mentioned, the western leatherwood and San Francisco dusky-footed woodrat. There are some opportunities for habitat restoration, and Ivy can speak more to that if there are questions on that. And there are certainly multiple opportunities for periodic wildfire hazard reduction. Next slide, please. So in terms of next step, we have to finish these things up. These are all next steps. Well, not all. The first 4 next steps we need to complete in April, because our intent is to have a draft management plan together in April for city review. Once that plan has been sufficiently vetted, it'll go out for public feedback and then at some point make its way to city council for adoption. So that's what we have. We're happy to answer whatever questions this committee might have. So thank you.
And just a reminder on the schedule here, like John said, wrapping up the open space management plan in May with public review at the time, and then going to council in July. Just want to say thank you all for your participation, and we're going to talk to the advisory committee for questions and comments. You guys should be able to unmute yourself. Greg, you want to go?
Yeah, so just to be clear of the process, you're expecting the committee to ask questions, then will there be public comment and then committee comment?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, okay, I may have some more questions, but just to kick things off, one, thank you so much. This is really great information and really helpful, especially laid out the context and all the process. So thank you for that. My two questions. One, when you talked about the dollar allocation and it being kind of hypothetical, will you be able to provide some guidance as to what's the best practice for dollar allocation, or does it vary widely based on the space in question?
I think a little bit of both. So, I mean, there are some standards that people have used over the years for open space management planning, but just in the last 5 years, with wildfire severity, for an example, increasing, people's allocation priorities, in my experience, have changed dramatically. So what we can do is provide sort of range of costs or level of efforts that other entities that we've worked with have been doing, at least in the last couple of years.
Got it. Okay, great. And then the second one, on the preliminary conclusions slide, I think it'd be super helpful if there was a little bit more time spent or a little bit more information. I'm trying to understand the gap between point 1 and point 2 that you had. And point 1 was that there are existing plans for certain things. And point 2 was, again, I think it's a little bit of a nomenclature thing, right? You talk plans, then there's policies. And so you have to help reconcile that plan versus policy, and are both policies really, and just plan was used for the first one, and just really understanding kind of how is number 2 really an additive to 1, or are there things that really kind of have to fine tune things that are already defined or change? It's just, I think that's like a huge, open question for me.
Sure. I think that's an excellent question. That's why I made the point toward the end of the presentation that all 10 of these categories need to be clearly defined. And I think your point that, yeah, maybe there's some overlap between the two. I mean, I'm looking now at like trail maintenance versus trail management. Yes, there is some overlap. Basically, we looked at policies from existing plans that the city had, existing policies and goals. And then we looked at the same kind of items, goals and policies, and these other best in class plans. What we found in looking in those best in class plans was much more emphasis on adaptive management, much more emphasis on protecting riparian resources and dealing with wildfire hazards that we had found in the city's 7 planning documents that we received. So those received items of emphasis. We also found in the Marin Road and Trail Management Plan just a lot more information about trail management, which is a little different than maintenance. Maintenance is a part of management, but there was just a lot more attention given in the Marin document compared to some of the older documents we looked at in terms of how trail systems should be managed. And just as an example, I cited 2 best in class documents that we want to rely on. The Los Angeles County Trails Manual, that's about a 1,000-page document. So there's a lot of detail that can be brought to into the process. We want to bring it in, sort of incorporating by reference. We don't want to create a 1,000-page document just on trail management. But to your point, there is some overlap in those categories, but there are several particular ones like wildfire hazards, e-bikes, adaptive management that we really wanted to hit on developing new policies for or adapting policies from other best in class plans.
Got
Does that
it.
answer your
So
question?
it does, and this may be a gross oversimplification, but it sounds as if one has been mostly, while solid, reactive in nature, and 2 really tries to be more proactive and really thinking kind of more than surface deep in terms of some of the things that we need to address.
Yeah, I think the second set of categories deals more with climate change and resiliency and trying to get in front of that, and adaptive management has a big role to play in that, and also to get ahead of whatever emerging recreation activities are. So e-bike use has taken the open space community by storm in the last couple of years. I'm on a committee to do a panel session on this at a conference at the end of the month. So we want to get ahead of sort of, things that are emerging issues. So I say reactive versus proactive. That's probably a reasonable distinction to make. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Lynn, you're up.
Thank you. Back to the allocation, could you tell me where did you find those percentages of wildfire mitigation and restoration? Where did those percentages come from?
Those were purely arbitrary. I put together sort of a hypothetical allocation when I put this presentation together. And I guess top of mind for me is wildfire hazards. And since our company does a lot of habitat restoration, that's always top of mind as well. So like I said, it wasn't meant to reflect maybe what the city's interested in or this committee's interested in, or even what the public's interested in. It was just basically some numbers to demonstrate the concept.
Oh, I see. So they were self-generated.
They were definitely self-generated, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Eli?
Hi, yeah, and thank you for that interesting report. I'm curious to better understand, in your slide, you mentioned habitat conditions show minimum degradation, and you referenced, and I'm wondering if you, in that point, if you're referencing the 2 species that were highlighted specifically, the western leatherwood and I think the dusty-footed wood rat, or if you meant broadly that habitat conditions have show minimum degradation.
I think I'll defer to Ivy on that one.
Yes, we were looking more broadly at the habitat conditions, and when we developed our qualitative metrics for how we determine if something was like in really high condition, medium, low, etc., we have like buckets of native versus non-native vegetation, because usually non-native vegetation is indicative of like humans bringing in a lot of like foreign materials and seeding itself. And we also made note of any significant vegetation trampling. If we notice people were cutting things maybe like unauthorized, I did see some of that on one of the trails next to residences where somebody had lopped off the top. So it's a very broad description. And my observation was that Most of these communities are composed of native species, which was really like heartening to see, because I have seen open spaces and just habitats that have been totally overtaken by like Scotch broom or just like not a single strand of native material. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is this another way of saying that our open spaces are in relatively good condition?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eli. Susan? Oh, wait, Susan, you're muted. One sec.
Classic move. Sorry about that. I was just saying thank you. This is really interesting, and I have a couple of questions. Clarifying what, say, the advisory committee is being asked, and then I guess down the road, someone said at the beginning, well, that there was three choices, or sort of the middle of the road, and then you had the either side. You said that. Then you also were asking, I think you're going to be asking for input on the pie chart, or how there's an allocation. Is there ultimately going to be one recommendation that comes out? Like the plan will say, here is the one way that we are all recommend, or like there's a recommendation. It's one thing that's the goal of what this process is. Is that accurate?
I think so. I don't want to speak out of turn, but yeah, typically, we generate a couple alternatives just to give us options. And we're trying to avoid the extreme kind of the straw dog options of, bookending these. But yeah, I think ultimately we want to land on a particular management alternative and say, well, we looked at these two, but this alternative, this set of goals, policies, and implementation actions is the open space management plan.
Balances. Okay, so then thank you. And then a follow-up question is, this presentation that we've just heard is primarily about the natural elements. I heard one main thing about the use of it, which you talked about e-bikes. There's also a thing about looking at scenery or something, but will the work that you're doing give any more recommendation or looking at how it's used? I think there's a lot of discussion that we've had and input from the public on those who want to hike, those who want to bike, in different ways. And will this management plan be helping us talk about that together? Or is it really more about the natural elements, if you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, it's balancing recreation uses, but also, doing things that are environmentally sustainable, either protecting what's there or protecting and enhancing what's there. So yeah, it'll speak to that. I can't give you more particulars at this point in time, just because of where we are in the process. But yes, it will deal with balancing recreation uses and what kind of uses will occur going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ula.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for a really great sort of preview of this report, and looking forward to hearing kind of where you land on a lot of these things, especially given the input that you get. One of the questions that I have was regarding, so you kind of identified three main goals of managing sensitive resources, balancing recreational uses, and mitigating hazards. And in the third department, mitigating hazards, it sounded to me like most of what you were looking at in terms of hazards had to do with wildfire. And I was just wondering if you had identified any other hazards that you are looking at in sort of the big picture.
I'd say we've been focused on wildfire hazards at this point, but there could be other hazards related to storm events, or related to soil loss, or mass movement of soil. We haven't looked at that. We haven't focused on that yet, but I think our intent was to broadly define hazards so that we're not always preoccupied or just looking at wildfire.
So would like a blind turn on a narrow trail, would that be considered a hazard? Like, would that kind of thing be taken into account? I'm just trying to understand where sort of the bikers and hikers and the safety comes in on this report.
Right. So when we looked at those first 7 planning documents that the city did, that's where we basically put things into 4 categories. The last category is visitor safety and hazards management. So by my way of thinking, and we need to be explicit about this as we compile the plan, I think we mean natural hazards or, storm-related hazards, weather, but visitor safety is in that same category. So something like, coming around a blind turn, that would be covered under the visitor safety aspect of that category.
Okay, and just recommendations for how to maybe slow and warn both parties, that kind of thing. Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, that would
great.
be included. Yes, correct.
Great, thank you.
Scott?
Hi, John and Ivy and Leslie. Thanks for being here. I have 3 questions. They're kind of scattered, so I'm just going to throw them out there, and hopefully they can all be answered to some degree. I think I missed the definition for adaptive management. If somebody could brush on that again. I don't understand that term. And then do you see if there are any opportunities for adding sustainably more trails to the system? Is there any space in there? Would you consider that a good idea? And I was very happy to hear that the habitat conditions you consider are actually pretty good. And I think that's pretty exciting. And then also, would the plan or your report include any type of plan on how to attack the invasive species that are in the park that it'd be nice to clear out of there at some point or another? Thanks.
Sure. Well, I can address the first 2, and I think I'll pitch the third and fourth ones to Ivy and or Leslie. But so in terms of adaptive management, just to paraphrase from the definition, it's basically the need for it is driven by the fact that there are changes in resource conditions that in some cases are occurring rapidly due to the climate changing. And the idea is to basically collect information on resource conditions, whether it's the conditions of the trail, the conditions of the vegetation that can serve as wildfire fuel, and basically seeing how those conditions change over time, and then setting some standards that would cause you to not react, but to act based on changes in what's happening. So it's a more dynamic way of looking at planning, whereas, older plans said this is the way we're going to do things. We're going to manage trails in this way for the next 30 years. Adaptive management says we'll look at the trails every 2 years or every 4 years or every 3 years and look at whether we need to relocate some trails or whether we need to recontour a trail or whether we need to close a redundant trail. So adaptive management, that's the definition. We'll probably refine it some more. In terms of adding trails, we have not specifically looked at the question of, well, is there enough habitat to add trails? So I think under the category of visitor demand and use, which is the third category related to the first set of plans we reviewed, we'll think about that issue. I'm not sure where we're going to land on it, but it's something that we're hearing, from different elements of the public. So we need to respond to it in some fashion. The habitat and the invasives, I'm going to pitch those to Ivy.
Could you repeat the question regarding habitat?
Sure. So there's a ton of Scotch broom in there, and then there's also the prickly weed that grows along the side of the trails that I see. That's especially prevalent in San Juan Canyon right now and this time of year, and it kind of along all the trails. It seems to just follow the trails, and I think it's crowding out native species. So will there be any sort of plan in your report for remediation or for the city to work on that kind of stuff?
Okay. I did pick up on the invasive species question. And I'm not certain about what the plan is at the moment, but during my habitat assessment, I did start taking points of where all of these invasive species were located. So among them, I didn't know Scotch or French broom, pampas grass, there's ice plant, and then I'm not sure. So the prickly weed could refer to a couple of things. There's bull thistle and there's like star thistle. Is it like a thistle type of plant? Anyway, that's beside the point. It's prickly and it's weedy. But if typically what I see in management plans is that agencies will take the California Cal IPC integrated. I forgot what IPC stands for. It's like integrated pests something. But they rank invasive species based on limited, moderate, and then high. And usually agencies will just take moderate and high ranked species and then will prioritize resources and efforts on kind of combating these sorts of things. So I think dealing with the invasive species will likely be part of the plan. I can't speak on behalf of Bridget and the open space planning effort now, but we will recommend. Yes. Okay, yes, so we will make recommendations in terms of what to do for these invasive species, and usually early detection, quick response is one of the primary things we do when we see something cropping up. We recommend to get out there and tackle the species before the seed heads start to drop, or trying to prevent spread, informing people about how not to spread these things, because sometimes people will pick it up in their shoes and then bring it to other locations. So did that sufficiently answer your question, or is there any points that you wanted me to dive into?
That's great, thank you.
Okay. I could just add to that briefly. There's a whole bunch of different types of ways that you can address invasive species in trail complexes. A lot of the times it's hand removal, depending on the location of the population of the species. Sometimes it can be mowing if it's near an entrance, near a parking area. So there's a lot of different options. There's also species specific methods that work better than others. So all of that would be taken into consideration should the city decide to do an overall invasive species management plan associated with the open space.
Any more questions from the advisory committee? I'm going to open it up to Bob. What do you have?
Yeah, hi, and thanks for the report. It's very extensive. I was trying to take notes as you're going, and it's difficult to capture all the information, but again, an extensive report, which is very much appreciated. Couple of questions, and maybe this one would go back to Bridget, is again, what do you want to see from this particular meeting as an outcome from the advisory committee? What result do you want to see? And John, you did bring up a couple of the points that I had with, I think Ula brought questions on the trail safety and so on. I think that's an important part of certainly what I personally would love to see improved. And then also, again, some of the damage, that's been done over the years. Again, how that would be improved. Again, I guess it goes with the whole trail maintenance issue. But again, there's just so much information here. I actually wish I had more time to absorb all the information to be able to make some additional comments. But Bridget, what do you want to see out of the, this meeting from the advisory committee?
Sure. Thank you, Bob. And we all acknowledge that we're putting a lot of information out there to you, and we just kind of finished packaging it together tonight. That's why you didn't get anything earlier than this. So we understand that there's you probably need some time to digest it all. So our goal would be to hear just actually the comments that you made, Bob, when you said, I'm concerned about this and this. These are sort of my two priorities. So maybe what if we ask the committee to send us, maybe think about the conversation and then send us an email if you're not ready to tell us tonight. Maybe rank those 4 categories that were in that pie chart, John, that you were showing. And that would sort of give us an idea of how the advisory committee is feeling, how they might rank those 4 goals of this plan. This presentation is going to be available online. We'll mail all of you a link to it as well. It's going to be available on the PROS advisory, on the PROS project website, and a recording of this meeting with John's words speaking to everybody's words speaking to the slides will also be available shortly. So you'll have a little more time to sort of revisit it and check back in. And catch up on things that you missed for this evening. So if you're not ready to sort of rank some things tonight, then please just send me an email, or actually send it to me and copy Dana on it. I think you got her email address in the invitation. And then we can collect those responses from you, and that'll give us an idea of how this advisory committee weights those four or ranks those four things. They're all going to be a component, but it would be helpful to know everybody's sort of relative preferences for those. And also from this evening, Bob, the other thing is the questions that we're hearing from you are good ones to make sure that we're touching on all the points. We've heard from the community, from the very beginning of this plan about the concerns and questions and opportunities that we have in the open space. So it's been a while since we've gathered, so it's good to hear those again tonight. I did want to comment really quickly about the invasive species. And, as you know, we do have some volunteers out there working on that right now, trying to capture some of the broom while it is in season now. And we've put together some grant applications to try to help with getting some additional funding to do that kind of work. I know that a lot of the plants, particularly those prickly ones, have just exploded, it seems, in the last 3 weeks after that rain. So we're well aware of those things out there.
I did notice that the pampas grass, somebody had deadheaded it, and I made note of that too. So it was good to see.
Okay. So some of that we're doing with our own staff, or when we have some CAL FIRE crews, and some of it is being done by volunteers as well.
Ula, you had more questions?
Yeah, sorry. So just in terms of giving weight to the various categories, I think it could be helpful if we had a little more information, or maybe allowed a little more time to pass to understand the report's assessment of where we stand on some of those issues. Like, we just got a report on habitat, and that the habitat is in really pretty good shape in that area. And in that event, I would probably put less emphasis in terms of resources on habitat. So I think it might be helpful to get a little more perspective, or maybe allow a little more time before we start allocating or giving our idea of allocating resources, because I think it's really important to understand sort of where we stand currently.
Great points. Austin, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, make a similar comment to Ula. One, like an example being like our, wildfire safety, or the risk of, wildfire in our open spaces, it could be a complete disaster. And that's something that we need to prioritize, significantly more than anything else in the short term. So it'd be helpful to know sort of where, like Ula mentioned, where we stand in some of those areas, like at least a high level sort of assessment in order to prompt a more informed response. And then, at the risk of asking Bridget to do something else, if we're going to respond via email, whatever that mechanism is to provide that response, if you could maybe categorize those areas where you want us to respond to, so it's clear in all sort of in one sort of concise location. That'd be really helpful for me anyway.
Sure, that makes sense. Maybe we could sort of put something together. I'll work with the consultants. We put something together and kind of send it out to you as a quick survey.
Caroline?
Yes, I just wanted to also agree with Ula. I think it's premature to be able to prioritize if you don't really know the facts, especially with the environmental assessment. It sounds like there are 2 special status species. It sounds there was a bullet point that the habitat looks like it's in relatively good condition, but frankly, I would like to see an actual assessment or report before I decide how to delineate percentages of priorities. So I do think it's premature. Any type of form would be helpful. That's a great suggestion from Austin. And then I'm not sure if this is our last meeting as the advisory committee, but it seems like since this is sort of the beginning, it might be helpful to have another one in the future, and then be able to look at the bigger picture and have more information before we comment and have additional questions.
Noted. Thanks, Caroline. I just want to make sure. David?
Yeah, I'll just
make this one point because I'm a little confused. The hypothetical effort dollars, over what period of time are we talking about?
Well, I would say 15 years if we're sticking with the time period for the overall pros plan, 15 years.
Okay. All right. That's helpful. So that, I mean, perhaps you ramp up certain dollars and you drop it down over time because you accomplish some of your goals or priorities have changed. So just, you know, just saying 38% might not do it because it might not be specific enough.
Yeah, point well taken. I think we'll work with the city on that, on putting some, you know, focused language and, like Bridget said, in the form of a survey to give you some good guidance on how to respond.
Thank you.
Sure.
Lynn?
So just to confirm, on the PROS website, the actual slides will be available, so we don't have to
Yes.
see the entire video.
Yes.
All
Yes,
right,
it
and
will.
then tomorrow night's, not that, wouldn't love to hear this again. Tomorrow night's Park and Rec Commission, will it be the same slides or will there be a more in-depth presentation, more like the data behind the slides?
No, there won't be. I was just going to give a verbal update that we had an advisory committee meeting tonight and sort of recap the, you know, the comments and the questions that you had here this evening. So it's not going to be any additional new information.
Okay, so I guess I'm like everybody else. I'd like some additional information before putting in more of my opinion. Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks, everyone. Just want to make sure we have no more questions from the advisory committee before we open it up for public comment. Not seeing any hands. One second. We're going to give public 2 minutes to talk. The first I see on my list is Denise. So just one moment, Denise, and I will ask you to unmute. Denise?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
hi,
I can.
thanks. My name's Denise Bobel, and I'm one of the volunteers with Friends of Water Dog that takes out French broom in Water Dog. And I just wanted to say, I don't know if the consultants of WRA is aware of this, but the reason that the whole issue of this assessment came up was because a wildlife ecologist did an assessment of what's happening and occurring in Water Dog. And I just didn't hear any response to any of the issues raised in that report. And I wanted to make sure that WRA has that report and has looked at it and is going to be addressing that. And then number two, it's kind of concerning to hear that you're saying that protecting sensitive resources, and also in another area you talked about special status species. Clearly, the general plan does not just provide protection for the special status species in sensitive areas like riparian areas, but it actually states as a policy, maintain functional wildlife corridors and habitat linkage in order to contribute to the regional biodiversity. And so what I'm questioning is you're comparing a little Water Dog, less than 300 acres, to Marin County Parks with 18,000 acres, Mid-Penn, 65,000 acres, Los Angeles Trails, 550 miles. And I'm wondering, do you have any expertise in small areas? Because I understand they have very different goals and objectives for these large areas. They can have lots of trails because they have more acreage. We have a very small acreage, and we are seeing, I'm shocked to hear you say you think this habitat looks good. And all I can say is you have not seen what it looked like 10 years ago. That's all I can say, because this habitat is undeniably in decline. And I would love to meet with Ivy and John and go out for a hike.
That's 2 minutes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thaddeus, you have 2 minutes.
All right, thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? Excellent. I just wanted to say thanks to WRA and to Gates Associates and to our commissioners and on the committee for such a careful discussion about such an important topic. I think that the points I want to make tonight are that we all, I think, share a really common goal, which is that we love this place, this little tiny jewel, of Belmont. We all want to protect it. And what I see when I go out there is a really vibrant recreational open space. It's for multi-use. I was just out there today riding my bike, but I'm often out there hiking or running with my dog. And I see that there's just a lot of happy people there. I've been using these trails for 17 years. And if anything, the environment has improved over time. And that's largely because of the work of volunteers like Kevin Sullivan and other folks who are improving the trails and making sure that we have less erosion over time. I think the history of the park is really interesting. I mean, this is a place where developers used to dump their dirt from Hallmark homes being built. And there's, old roads in there. And there's street signs buried in trees. But through stewardship, the forest has really grown back and it's really improved. And we have, as we've heard, a very healthy ecosystem. And I really appreciate it for what it is. A couple of questions for you guys just to think about on these discussions. One, I didn't hear about sudden oak death. I'd love to hear about mitigation efforts for that. I feel like it's rampant potentially out there at some point, if not now, then soon. Comments on the houses encircling the park. They are dumping their yard waste, their Roundup, and stuff like that, polluting the trails. So those are my main concerns. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thaddeus. Up next is Kristen Mercer.
Thank you, committee, and thank you very much to WRA, because most of what I hear from you is very welcome news. It's great to hear somebody agree on the needs of sustainable management, particularly the distinction between management and maintenance. Because in my definition, good management, the better your management, the less maintenance you need. And so if we're talking about prioritizing our funding, I agree with what David Bronstein said, that maybe up front, what we need is to invest heavily in improving our management and improving the alignment of our trails so that we can avoid having to do the maintenance long-term. If you don't have proper management up front, you can't possibly keep up with the maintenance. And so that's where the adaptive management comes in. So I'm very, very pleased to hear that policy being put into effect. I agree with other callers that if you think the open space is in good condition, you haven't been here as long as us. We've been seeing it for 30 years. And if you would like, I'll take a walk with you and point to you the damages. I agree with Thaddeus Block that we have a problem with the homes damaging the space behind themselves. I agree with Denise that you haven't seen the invasive species because thankfully we have Friends of Water Dog down there removing it. I don't think it's as in a good a shape as you think, because from my backyard, I can point to dozens of dead trees that died just in the last 12 months over the course of winter that are now dead. And so we do have increasing sudden oak death. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing your written assessment. I agree with everyone else on the committee that we need more information in writing before we can give you any recommendations. And so I look forward to seeing that very much. Thank you for your time.
Wendy, you're up next.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So thank you for tonight's presentation. I think it was very reassuring to hear the systemic approach that's being taken. As a 25-year resident of Belmont, I would have to agree that from a conservation standpoint, there are species we no longer see in the last 25 years. I recall having lots and lots of quail. Now I can go a year or two without seeing a quail family. So that's an example of where we are seeing some of our species disappear based on my own just kind of personal observation. I do appreciate that we're looking at the fire hazard issues. And I think what's really important is understanding what we don't know about the fire hazards to come And so I appreciate that we're thinking long and hard about that and looking for data in that regard. I appreciate that we're looking at evaluating the current trails. I know in a previous hearing, we talked about, there was some conversation about the 16 miles of bike trails that have been cut into the open space. I think understanding what the impact of that is super important from a long-term strategy standpoint and understanding what that impact should be. So I couldn't be happier with the conversations that happened tonight. And my thanks to all on the committee and all the hard work that's being done right now, because I think these are exactly the types of conversations that need to be had. So thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Next is Jack.
Hello. Can you hear me? Great.
We can hear you.
Hi, my name's Jack. Yeah, I'd just like to echo some of the comments here, just giving a big thanks to everyone who's been part of the process. I dialed into the very first meeting and been along for the ride so far, and it's been really great to see the collaborative way everyone's been engaging. So I've been a resident of San Mateo for about 4 years, and I'm a volunteer with the Water Dog Trail Keepers. I was actually part of the group that rehabilitated the low erosion zone that Ivy showed. That was previous on Upper Creek Trail. That was actually previously a high erosion zone, and myself and others got in there with pickaxes and really tried to smooth it out. So yeah, with the Water Dog Trail Keepers have done numerous efforts like this, sort of working to sustain the trails, rehabilitate the trails, and also close off some unsustainable trails in the last couple of years. I'd like to voice my support for maintaining the multi-use designation of the trails, as that, in my reading against the guiding principles that are published on the website at the moment, is sort of the best way to really meet the inclusive and equitable access points and the facilitating activities across a range of interests and actively maintaining the spaces. I would also like to ask the WRA to also reach out, if possible, to 2 other really great trail stewardship organisations in the region that are actually local. So this is the Santa Cruz Mountains Trail Association, and then the it's the Santa Cruz Mountains Trail Stewardship, and then there's the Sierra Buttes Trail Stewardship. These are 2 local organisations that have done a bunch of great work building sustainable trail networks, one up in the Los Sierras and the other sort of just down the Santa Cruz Mountains there. And they've really shown that, well-built and maintained trails can really facilitate enjoyment by a variety of users. I think that's, the last thing I'd like to spend my time on. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jack. Christian, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation today. It was good to hear. And I am a resident of Belmont for more than a decade, living really next at the trailhead of Water Dog. So I really see that as my extended backyard. And my children have been on the trails before they were born and ever since. And we have been hiking there kind of multiple times a week. And I'm very happy to see bikers, runners, dogs, children, older people all sharing these trails. And I really hope that this can stay that way, because I have, in my whole decade here, never seen any conflict between any of these groups. I'm very happy with the trails. I'm proud to say I'm sure I've been on every trail multiple times, and they are in really good shape. I really enjoyed them, and so please keep them open and keep the good management up. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Up next is Kevin.
Hello, thanks. I'm Kevin Sullivan. As Thad mentioned, I've been working on the trails for quite some time. And I'd just like to kind of bring up that point that trail work and the partnership that the city has developed with a number of different volunteer groups over the years is really culminating in this process that we're seeing now. If we remember, really, in 1998 master plan, there was an idea to start putting trails in what was really just a bunch of old development roads, right? A lot of the current trails, Rambler and others, were roads that were built by bulldozers, and they were going to put houses all around them. And those just sat through the 60s and 70s. And there was some times when it was dangerous in Water Dog Park. And then things started to change. And then some people started building trails by hand that cars and trucks can't go onto. And we worked with the city to create a partnership to develop some maintenance and management possibilities. It's a very big place. It's very challenging. And we were kind of the afterthought for a long time. But now it's such a focus. People are so aware of how many people enjoy the open space that the partnership with the community and the city has developed. It's sort of had to. And we're in a great position here to take this work that you guys have done, that the commission has done, and that the consultants have done, very professional document that really is going to give us a chance to really step to the next level in that partnership and manage the way that the community decides to more effectively, I believe. So thanks for everybody's work.
Thank you, Kevin. Jennifer, you're up next.
Hi. Yes, first of all, thank you to the WRA for the presentation. I also agree that, of course, we'd like to see a lot more details because this seems like an overall good outline, but we need more information. I'm a little bit concerned looking at the pie chart, although I know the figures are hypothetical. It seems to me that, trail maintenance at 14% and adaptive trail management at 12%, they appear to be low on your priority list. And I think they should actually be one of the higher ones, quite frankly. As Ivy showed the photos regarding the low erosion, the medium erosion, and the high erosion pictures, I mean, that is very, very concerning. The high erosion is really something I myself haven't even seen, even though I've taken a lot of photos and looked at it. And so the question becomes, what is the reason for this erosion? I mean, we don't have a lot of rains here and whatnot. So, the question is it due to, the increased biking or e-bikes or whatever? I mean, we need to find out the reasons for this, and this, will be part of the trail maintenance and adaptive trail management that needs to be discussed. I'm also concerned about illegal trails, which have been proliferating and without any, seems like any control. And, finally, I truly believe as a hiker that the narrow single trails should be reserved for hikers due to the safety, because I have seen people on these narrow trails just have to run up the sides or down the slopes just to get out of the way. So we need to make sure that that is part of your plan and it's clearly delineated and clearly spelled out.
Thanks, Jennifer.
So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next is Scott.
Hi, I just want to thank the WRA for their work here. This is a great report. I'm particularly happy to hear that the habitat is looking good. I support the continued multi-use trails, and I've been visiting here for more than 25 years, and just regarding the comments that I've heard that the park is in decline, I can tell you I have photos and video of my visits going back many years, and I can tell you from personal experience, and I think I know a number of other people who have got similar experience, that the exact opposite is true. The park is in better shape than it's ever been. If you look at the pictures we saw of rutted trails, there were more rutted trails there 10, 20 years ago than there are now. The park is improving dramatically over time and not declining. And I guess one thing that I would hope to hear out of this is some of the objective data that supports some of the decisions that might come out of this. I've heard some that there were additional categories added as management issues, such as redundant trails. I'd love to know more about the data that suggests that trails are redundant or that that's a bad thing. And moreover, I'd love to see a parallel conversation that's similar to what Scott Sizemore suggested, that maybe more trails are in order, and maybe that would help reduce the friction on the existing trails. And in general, again, on that data point, I would love to see other other different types of organizations polled, not just Marin, which is notoriously anti-mountain biking. And I think given the history the mountain bikers have and positive influence here at Waterdog, I'd love to see the Santa Cruz Trail Stewardship and others also, be looked at as a way to balance mountain biking with some of the other uses that we see. And lastly, on safety, we must have more than 20 years of data, have police or the medical, how many reports of actual incidents have occurred? I'd love to hear that data.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Let's see, Pat, you're up next.
Hello, my name is Pat Cubiello. Thanks for the overview of your paper. I look forward to reading the complete report. I'm with Friends of Waterdog and everyone who's concerned about invasive species in Waterdog. We are the group that is removing it, and we need volunteers. So everyone who's interested wants to remove the invasive species, volunteer with Friends of Waterdog. We can use on the assessment of the habitat degradation and the species of special interest. This is directed to Ivy. Were your assessments just based from the trail, or did you actually go into different areas to look for other stuff like different plants or different animal habitats or something like that? That's my first question. And the other one is that now I may be focused on this more than most people, but when I'm in there, I've spent 150 hours last year removing French broom and over 200 hours this year removing French broom. So there's a heck of a lot of French broom in there that has been removed. And I'm glad to say I've gotten most of the infestations out of there, but the surrounding areas are a problem. And I agree with Thaddeus that we need to also address the surrounding houses there, what they're putting into the habitat. And one of the things is the French broom in the surrounding houses, they are hanging over these waterways. So the seeds are being dispersed downstream into Waterdog, and they're creating more infestations down there. So this needs to be addressed too. If we're going to address invasive species in the open space, we need to also address the surrounding houses and maybe have a private public partnership where we can work with the residents to remove their French broom. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. I don't see any other hands. Would somebody else like to talk, or are we going to go back to the advisory committee? Oh, Paul, you're up.
Hi, just wanted to make a couple quick comments. I really appreciate the the work and the kind of also the scientific backgrounds of that WRA is bringing to this. So I support continued multi-use of the open space, and I think that our 30+ year history of multi-use in this open space is a real good example of a successful system, because we have had really over this past 30 years pretty harmonious user groups all using the open space together, and as we've seen now, there's a very healthy habitat. So it proves I think that our open space here proves that you can have it both ways. And I just kind of had a couple questions maybe I'd like to see the WRA address. One is, as you're probably aware, there's a very vibrant, volunteer trail maintenance community. We have the Waterdog Trail Keepers, which puts in hundreds of hours of maintenance per year. And one thing I'd maybe like to see WRA address is, how can we leverage those volunteer efforts with the city resources to keep our, sustainability going. And then number two, with regard to the erosion, I think the worst erosion is on John Brooks Trail, the big downhill section. And I think a lot of that, we have a very extensive concrete drainage ditch system in the park. And I've actually personally cleared out a lot of that stuff myself. But along John Brooks, where there's some really kind of steep hills and some bad erosion, you can see that there's a lot of that drainage infrastructure just completely clogged. And I wonder how much we can just improve the situation simply by clearing some of those drainage ditches, because you can just see the water erodes in the middle of the trail, but there's a ditch right next to it that could be carrying that water. So just something to keep in mind. But again, thank you very much. I think your work so far has been really excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Up next is Michael.
Hi, my name is Mike Monroe, and I want to also
add my voice to people who want to keep multi-use in the open space going. I've been a resident for 30 years and hiked, run, and biked in the open space. The trail system has improved greatly over time. I saw it 30 years ago, and it is way better now. The erosion comes and goes, and it is something that can be maintained, and that has been proven over time. I also think that this is a fantastic resource for Belmont as a community. It is a great place to meet people. It's a great place to go out and enjoy nature with friends and family. And it has to be inclusive for all users. It is, it is not a nature preserve. It is a community resource that all of us share and all of us have a stake in. And I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael. Did anybody else want to comment from the public? I don't see any more hands. No, okay. I am gonna go back to the advisory committee. If you had any last comments you would like to voice. Craig? Oh, sorry, Lynn first, then Craig, okay?
This is probably in your written notes, but how many recon missions did you take into San Juan Canyon and Water Dog to come up with these proposals?
I have been out at the site. Well, I've spent 3 days kind of going through the trails, and it was a combination of trails assessment and habitat assessment. So 3 days of 8 to 10 hours.
Wow. Thank you. And
Excuse me real quick. Let me just fill in there too. That was not just Ivy alone. There was typically either John was with her. We also had park staff there or some other WRA staff as well. So if you're talking about person hours, and I think they walked every bit of every trail. So they've seen it from every angle.
Yeah.
Just speaking for myself.
And then one follow-up question. One of the comments was 16 miles of trail, but I think in a presentation, someone had mentioned just 9 miles. Do you have that number somewhere? How many miles of trail in Water Dog and San Juan is it combined, or? It was mentioned somewhere. I wanted to say I heard 9.6, but I don't know where that came from.
Yeah, I mentioned that number, Lynn. I think that's what's officially recognized by the city, and that's what Ivy's referring to in terms of her level of effort.
And I did spend some time on the unofficial trails just to help me get an idea of the habitat types. So particularly in San Juan Canyon, I did venture off into the unsanctioned trail for the habitat assessment.
Thanks, Lynn. Craig?
Yeah, thanks. And so I guess I mean, first of all, I'm looking forward to diving in more, so I appreciate all this and with what's more to come. To me, I just really wanted to reiterate what I've been advocating across the board with pros, and that really kind of focuses on what's important to me is really having a balance between sustainability and enjoyment of the open space. And I totally agree that we need to be proactive, forward thinking, and build in the adaptability and flexibility. And also recognize that while we want to put as much kind of concrete information as possible, because this thing has a 15-year outlook, it can't address everything in all the detail, but should be really clear about what's most pressing and how to address that to the extent that we can. But for 5, 10, or 15 years down the line, I really want whatever we produce to provide insight into our thinking that could help guide future commissions, future committees, and future planning process. And then finally, just in terms of overall safety, which I believe is very important, my hypothesis is that if we increase the variety of usage, beyond just hiking and biking with the open space, I think that could lead to an increase in safety. So with more users and more types of use happening, I think that just naturally kind of opens it up to everyone being more sensitive, and lots more spots and locations and activities just kind of heightens everyone's awareness of how to try to keep safe. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig. Ula?
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to echo, I think the way Craig put that was quite articulate and eloquent. And I think in terms of safety, that increasing users and keeping it multi-use and just looking at every opportunity to make it as safe a space as possible is really what I'm looking for. And I just want to say thank you, because just knowing that you have taken this on is just incredibly helpful, and knowing that it is being looked at so systematically and so comprehensively is really reassuring as a commissioner. So I want to thank you for all of your efforts.
Susan?
Yeah, thank you. I'll piggyback on what Ula just said, because I think what's really helpful about this study is that it's giving us objectivity for things that I think everyone has their own impressions of the space and different views of it, but to be able to hear from folks who this is their work in general, and essentially give us a framework for how to look at this. And so I would say too, someone mentioned it earlier, but I think it'll be really helpful in your written document to give us some more objective definitions of how to look at things like even safety. And you'd mentioned earlier, hairpin turn, or like, what is a safe turn, what is not? Like, how can we think about that? Or how many species, or what would say that they were threatened or not threatened? Just all sorts of things that gives us a way to understand better the different aspects of what needs work, what's fine. All of that is, I think, really useful.
Thank you, Susan. Just wanted to ask anybody else for final comments. If not, we're only a tiny bit behind the schedule that we set, an hour and a half. So thank you all for your participation today and all your questions and comments. It's going to make the open space management plan even better than it already was on track to be. This will be posted, the recording, on the belmontprosplan.com website, as well as the slides that we showed today. And we will work on getting those framework questions that we have out to you to get your responses back. Thank you all again.
Thank you so much, everyone, committee and participants. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And good night. Have a nice evening.
Thanks,